All right, we're about to dive into one of early Hollywood's most devastating stories. It's a tragedy that really pulls back the curtain on the brutal machine grinding away behind all that silent film glamour. We're talking about a star the system basically built up just to break him down and, in the end, throw him away. And look, this wasn't just some small-time scandal. We have the legendary director Cecil B. DeMille, the guy was Hollywood, calling it the event that almost destroyed Hollywood. Just think about that. That's the scale we're dealing with here, a crisis that really shook Tinseltown to its absolute core. And right at the heart of this whole thing, it's this number, 31. That's how old Wallace Reed was when he died. He was Hollywood's biggest male star, and he was gone at just 31. Just an unbelievably tragic and brutal end. So that leads us right to the big question, right? How did the biggest star in Hollywood become its first major drug tragedy? This is a story about ambition, it's about exploitation, and yeah, it's about addiction. So how did the guy who seemingly had it all become this cautionary tale? Well, let's get into it. To really get the tragedy of the fall, you've got to understand the height he fell from. So let's go back to the peak. We're in the early days of Hollywood, right? Before sound changed the game. And there was one guy who was the absolute undisputed king. Before all the horror, Wallace Reed wasn't just a star, he was the star. Back then, in this new, booming world of silent movies, studios were a huge gamble. But Wally Reed, he was Paramount's sure bet. The guy was handsome, he was charismatic, and audiences they loved him. His movies didn't just make money, they were literally the engine that kept the entire studio running. And believe me, he was way more than just a pretty face. The guy's talent was just mind-blowing. He could act, of course, but he could also write, direct, play a bunch of different instruments. Oh, and he was a professional-level race car driver who did all his own insane stunts. No wonder one producer called him a 180-pound diamond. What a perfect description. But here's the thing. Behind that perfect all-American facade was a man who was deeply, deeply insecure. The newspapers are calling him the screen's most perfect lover. But behind closed doors, he was just full of self-doubt, battling this really intense inferiority complex. And it was that conflict, that struggle, that made him so vulnerable to what was coming. And that vulnerability, it was about to face the ultimate test. It all came down to one single catastrophic event, a moment that would send his entire life spinning completely out of control. Okay, so picture this. They're out filming on location for a movie called The Valley of the Giants. Suddenly, a train derails. It's chaos. Cast and crew are thrown everywhere into this wreck of metal and wood. And Reed, even though he's got a massive gash on his head and who knows what other injuries, he spends the next 12 hours helping everybody else. A total hero. But was the studio concerned about his recovery? Nope. Their priority was keeping their #1 asset on camera. So they sent in a studio doctor with a very simple and very devastating solution: morphine. Now, you gotta remember, back in the 1920s, morphine was kind of seen as this miracle drug. It could wipe out pain instantly. But the fact that it was super addictive, that was either not well understood or, let's be honest, probably just ignored on purpose. For the studio, it was perfect. It kept their star working, even through agonizing pain. But for Wally Reed, it was the beginning of the end. And that one decision, it kicked off this brutal 3-year nightmare where Paramount wasn't just enabling his addiction. They were actively fueling it. Why? To squeeze every single last drop of profit out of their dying star. And the physical toll, it was just horrifying. You couldn't deny it. Look at the numbers. In 1919, when the accident happened, he's a healthy 190 pounds. Just 3 years later, when he finally checks into a sanitarium, he weighs 122 pounds. He was literally a shell of the man he once was. It's honestly hard to even imagine how cruel those final days were. On the set of his last few movies, he was so weak his legs would just give out from under him. The crew literally had to prop him up against a wall to get a shot. The cameras were rolling on what was basically his death, in slow motion. Just try to wrap your head around that schedule. Over 20 movies in 3 years, all while he's dealing with a crippling injury and a full-blown addiction. There were times he'd finish one movie and be expected on the set for the next one only 6 hours later. It was just a relentless, absolutely merciless machine. And the sad part is, Reed's story wasn't unique. This was the system. This chemical cocktail was basically standard operating procedure for keeping stars productive. You'd get amphetamines, uppers, in the morning to power through a 14-hour shoot. Then at night, you'd get barbiturates, downers to force you to sleep. And all the while, for guys like Reed, there was the morphine, just constantly there to manage the pain and the stress. So who was enabling all this? Well, you had these guys called Dr. Feelgoods. And let's be clear, they weren't independent doctors looking out for patients. They were paid by the studio. Their job wasn't to keep the stars healthy. It was to keep them working. They were there to make sure the human machinery, the talent, kept running no matter what it cost them. So when Wallace Reed finally died in January of 1923, everything just exploded. The dam of secrecy that had been holding all this back completely broke. His death wasn't quiet. It became this huge public scandal that forced Hollywood to finally face its own dark secrets. And you have to see this in context. Reed's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was like the grand finale of a whole string of scandals that had the public completely convinced that Hollywood was just this pit of sin. You had the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, a mysterious murder. The media was screaming about moral rot, and the studios were terrified the government was about to step in and start censoring them. And the fallout was immediate. First, you have this massive public outcry, which leads to the creation of the Hays Office. That's the group that would eventually bring us the infamous production code, all to clean up Hollywood's image. But the most powerful response, the most personal one, that came from Reed's wife, his widow, Dorothy Davenport. Now, she could have just retreated in grief, and no one would have blamed her. But she didn't. She went on the attack. She took her husband's name, his story, and she produced and starred in a movie called Human Wreckage. And this was not some subtle little film. It was a raw, in-your-face look at the horrors of drug addiction. She was using the power of the movies to fight the very system that killed her husband. And these were supposedly his last words as he went into the sanitarium. I will come out cured, or I won't come out at all. It's just heartbreaking. It shows you how determined he was, but it also kind of predicts his tragic fate. He knew. He knew this was his last fight. And this is where Dorothy Davenport was so brilliant. She completely took control of the story. She went out there and said, look, my husband wasn't some moral failure. He's not just another story of Hollywood excess. She toured the whole country with her movie, got up on stage and argued that Wally was a victim of a national drug problem and a medical system that let it happen. She turned a celebrity scandal into a public health crisis. And her work, it had a real, tangible impact that lasted. The money from Human Wreckage and from her tour, it all went to create the Wallace Reed Foundation Sanitarium. This was one of the very first treatment centers in the U.S. specifically for addicts. She managed to turn this unbelievable personal tragedy into a legacy of hope, of actual help for so many other people. But that leaves us with one last question, doesn't it? Yeah, Hollywood cleaned up its image with the Hays Code, but did the system underneath, the system of exploiting stars for profit, did that ever really go away? 100 years later, we're still hearing stories about insane pressure, overwork, and substance abuse in the industry. It really makes you wonder, did the machine that chewed up and spit out Wallace Reed ever actually stop running?